Hello and welcome to another episode of Rational Actors on Blogging Heads. I'm Kevin Glass, Director of Policy at the Franklin Center, and today I'm joined by...
Hey, I'm Cathy Reisenwitz. I am Editor-in-Chief of Sex and the State, and I also have a newsletter called Sex, Tech, and Pop Culture. It goes out every weekday in the morning, and if you'd like to subscribe, head on over to cathyreisenwitz.com, and there's a subscribe.
Yeah, thanks for coming on with me. You had a really interesting piece last week. It was last week, right? That was pretty provocative and really tried to get into, and I think your work is great. You write about feminism in the online space and kind of the intersection of that movement and pop culture, but about why feminism and the feminist label doesn't appeal to more people than it maybe should. But you talked about an aspect that I haven't really read that much about, and that's kind of the left-wing political economy aspects of the feminist movement. And I wanted you to kind of summarize that for me and maybe expound upon it.
Yeah, for sure. So I wrote a piece. It was really inspired by a Twitter fight. I spend way too much time on Twitter, and I was fighting with Megan Murphy, who is, I don't know, kind of typical of a certain kind of feminism, which is kind of most offensively anti-sex worker. It's a very condescending kind of feminism that says that women who engage in sex work are not able to consent to that. And so where they think that they're doing a job, that's the best option for them given their choices. Feminists like Megan Murphy, sex negative feminists, rad femmes will say, you need to be saved. And some of them say you need to be saved. It's always by outside forces. Sometimes it's police, sometimes it's, rescue organizations, but no matter what, it's someone needs to get between you and what you're doing with your body right now. So I thought about that a lot, and then I was just thinking about the more general problem of, okay, I understand feminism as this is the movement to oppose sexism. Why in the world is that controversial? Why do people oppose something that's so obviously good? And I think that it has to do with a problem that a lot of mass movements have, which is that the craziest voices get seen as representative of these ideas. The ideas are good and solid and really not that controversial. Women are people. That's not like a crazy concept. But when you have people like Megan Murphy saying, sex workers aren't people, there's something below that and they don't deserve to own their own bodies and decide what to do with them, well, then you have people saying, well, then feminists are crazy. So kind of broke out what I see as most problematic within feminism into three M's: Marxism, misandry, and mysticism. So the Marxist angle was feminists have, to a certain extent rightly and to a certain extent wrongly, associated capitalism with patriarchy. So going through and trying to define, okay, what do they see as patriarchy? What do I see as patriarchy? And how do we define a word like capitalism? And what does it mean for women? And so I think that that's something that feminists that are, too well represented, in my opinion, in both, they have access to wide audiences because they are able to get published and they are in academia. They associate feminism with opposition to capitalism in such a way that normal people, I think, are put off by it because they're not opposed to, they understand that scarcity is real and that that markets are the best way to deal with the problem of scarcity.
Right, and this kind of associates, I would guess, all of feminism with economic theory, which is kind of counterintuitive to me. Sorry about that. Our connection cut off. But what you were just talking about kind of associates feminism in general as, to me, secondary to our economic system. I mean, and you might say, capitalism is obviously imperfect, but it still is the best way to achieve gender equality. And on the other side, the sex negative feminists and the anti-sex worker feminists might say, no, obviously not. We need, to tear down our capitalist institutions. But that seems to kind of say it's what's less important is, I guess, achieving gender equality in the world in which we currently live. And what's more important is tearing down all of our institutions. And to a certain extent, I do buy that, because you look at some of the problems that we're facing here, and it might look like such a massive uphill battle, such a mountain, that maybe the easiest way is to tear down all of society and replace it with a brand new economic system from the ground up, in which, we don't have patriarchal institutions that have been around for hundreds or thousands of years. So I do see a certain kind of intuitive appeal in that. But it does seem to me to just say, making progress within our current status quo is basically meaningless.
Yeah, I think it's tough. I think that that mainstream feminists, or I wouldn't even say mainstream, I would say Marxist feminists, they either believe that that Marxism would, or I guess I should say, ending capitalism, whatever you'd want to replace it with, that replacing capitalism with a different economic system would be effective in ending patriarchy. They think that is either the most important thing, that ending patriarchy is the most important thing that we could accomplish, or they want to see capitalism ended for other reasons as well. So that's an issue. I think that they're wrong, that replacing capitalism would be even particularly helpful to ending patriarchy. And I certainly disagree that ending patriarchy is the most important thing. And it's frustrating to be talking to other feminists who are, more radically anti-capitalist than I am, and, to be told that, well, then I'm not like a real feminist because I don't prioritize equality between the sexes to the point that they do. And, I will own that. I don't prioritize equality between the sexes above everyone's ability to eat. And that's what I see as on the line when you're talking about fighting capitalism. Capitalism is not ideal. It is absolutely built on and exploits, discrepancies between the sexes. It's a sexist system. And it annoys me on the other side when you've got, free marketers who are saying, well, I'm not sexist. And okay, all right, so if we do nothing to the economic system or only increase markets, that in and of itself doesn't do a lot for gender equality. I mean, it does a lot for gender equality, but it's not going to solve the problem. And so some will say, well, they'll deny that and say that people aren't really sexist. Government is sexist. And so if we got rid of government, then we would get rid of sexism. And it's like, no, that's kind of silly. And then other people will say, government is such a problem that sexism doesn't matter comparatively. And I'm like, no, that's not where I'm at either. I think sexism does matter. I think it's a problem with people and not just institutions. And so it requires its own efforts to end. But ultimately, like I said, what I think is on the line is people's ability to, I think that as technological innovations happen, scarcity decreases and we have more time to worry about things like sexism. We have more energy and resources to battle these, these bigotries that are really base and not well thought out. We have more tools to use to progress when we are all wealthier, which is, I think, what happens when you advocate for markets.
Right, and I hadn't actually heard this Marxist criticism of sex work before, which basically comes down to, as I understand it, no labor within a capitalist economy is truly voluntary. It's all coercion because, you have to go and sit in an office for 8 hours in order to eat and sleep, and nobody really wants to go sit in an office for 8 hours every day. And I guess just being more on the right or on the conservative side of the spectrum in that movement, the more traditional, criticism of legalizing sex work is, it legalization would lead to an increase in abuse. And so, right now the entire thing is a gray economy, and it's certainly rife to abuse right now, but legalizing it wouldn't really help the gray market aspects of it. And that, while legalizing it would bring some of it into the light and maybe make some of them safer, it would also expand the gray portions and make even more women subject to abuse, and, illegal trafficking and things like that. So that's kind of the criticism that I traditionally hear of sex work. I hadn't really heard, no actions or no economic transactions in a capitalist economy are truly consensual, and therefore, this concept of body ownership is really a lie. So that's I suppose, an interesting way to come at it. And I do see the logic there, even if probably like you, I do disagree with it.
I don't even disagree with the logic. I think that people who are not as steeped in anti-capitalism, don't give enough credit to the ways in which, coercion is not black and white, that scarcity itself is coercive, that we are artificially limited in our options by the distribution of capital that we have now, and the distribution of capital is absolutely indefensible economically or morally. All true. But where I think I disagree with the conclusion is that, first, these feminists make a special case for sex work, which I think is not defensible. There's not good evidence for it. There's not a good argument for it. It's kind of mystical. They kind of have to relate to patriarchy means that the barista consented, but the sex worker didn't. Kind of similar to what I see a lot of conservatives arguing, that God means that the barista consented, but the sex worker didn't, or that making somebody a latte is okay, but giving them a blowjob for money isn't. But no, I think, again, this is separate from if you don't make a special category for sex work and you just look at, we are all taking jobs, not 100% for, giggles and fulfillment, but because we will suffer injury if we don't, and that we don't all have the same access to the same, kinds of jobs because of the distribution of capital. Well, okay, what are you going to do about that? And most people look at that situation, and if they ever thought about it, they'd be like, yeah, I mean, that's true. Okay, are we going to insert more coercion to fix that problem and give everybody jobs and say, this is what you have to do? People are not on board with that so much. They want as much freedom as they can get within the current constraints. And so by posing as a solution to the reality of more coercion, I think a lot of anti-capitalist feminists alienate normal people.
Sure, yeah, and like you said, that is alienating, and you yourself have been called insufficiently feminist. I don't know if you've been called, not a feminist at all, or, a enforcer of the patriarchy or things like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think that part is really interesting in, a mass movement sort of way, which you raised earlier. Feminism has obviously been a movement that's been around for, centuries. And it's entered into this online era where, at least from my perspective, it's got, a legacy and historical figures. But I've seen, mass movements in the internet era have had a real trouble with both, branding. You mentioned, in any leaderless mass movement, sometimes the craziest people are the loudest, and that kind of quote unquote tarnishes the branding of something. And kind of a way of self-policing its own members. And in these ways, I'm thinking of, obviously these are much newer movements, movements like Black Lives Matter, movements like the Tea Party movement, movements like the Occupy Wall Street movement, which all suffer from the same problems as not having, places or leaders, or, even ideological principles that they can point to and say, this is what we believe in. If you don't believe in this, you're not a part of our group, but if you do, you are. And feminism has had that kind of problem for a long time, as any mass movement does. So like you said, you have been called, insufficiently feminist, not a feminist. And I wonder, have some of these self-policing issues from your perspective gotten better or worse as we've moved into the age of social communication and kind of the mass communication era?
I think as far as feminism, internal policing has gotten way better. And I think that it's because one of the primary problems with feminism is that, and it's this way with a lot of movements, is the people with a megaphone represent it. And the people with a megaphone have been academics, privileged white women for the most part, women who either through marriage or family, or their jobs just had the time to make the noise and the opportunities to get published and make a stink. And so feminism has been way overrepresented, has had privileged white women way overrepresented. I think that the internet, specifically Twitter, has opened up a whole new world of women who previously didn't have a way to participate in these conversations and get their voices heard. Now they're able to tweet right at these old white women and be like, no, like, this is, you arguing about the wage gap and not mentioning that it's, way worse for Black and Latina women is problematic, and you need to acknowledge that, and that's important. Incarceration, right? Like, that's an issue. The way that the criminal justice system treats trans individuals, like, that is more important than the likability gap. I'm sorry, right? And so I think that's great. I think a lot of people, especially people who used to be able to dominate the conversation, are upset about this turn of events. There was an article in The Nation, I guess 2 years ago, about, Twitter being toxic, and it's like, no, it's not toxic. You're just actually getting pushback in a way you never had before. But it's also frustrating. I understand when you're trying to get something accomplished and there's a lot of internal fighting. But at the same time, I think that from within a movement is really the only appropriate place to criticize. And I'm guilty of criticizing movements I'm not a part of. But ultimately, when I think about it, I think that is not the way to go, because you cannot really understand it, because you are only going to hear the craziest voices. So you're necessarily going to get a caricature of a movement you're not a part of, because you've got the craziest voices getting the most airtime on the one hand, and then you've got other people who oppose it describing it based on that caricature. And you just really, you can't get it. I think people who are in a movement are in the best spot to critique it and to get it back on track. And it's something that I experienced I was writing about libertarianism for a long time. And, I looked around at the other people who were, libertarians writing about politics, and they would write a lot about the left and sometimes the right, but usually the left. And it would be, these caricatures where there was no indication that this person understood where their ideological opposition was coming from. There was a lot of bad faith, a lot of assumptions of, bad intentions. But it was popular because people who are libertarian often don't like lefties. And so, you can just make a big career going on and on about how terrible left-wingers are. What I spent a lot of my time doing was telling libertarians how bad they were, which was not a good move for my career, and was very frustrating and alienated a lot of people. But at the same time, it's like, I still believe that that's the only way to do it, that from within a movement is the place to criticize it. And I'm not a libertarian anymore. I'm a Marxist anarchist. But, I am a feminist, and so that's kind of where I am, is from inside the movement. Some people call it infighting, but I think it's, okay, how do we challenge each other so that we are as effective and as 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 effective as we can possibly be. So I absolutely am a huge proponent of infighting for that purpose. I am proud of the people, who overlap with Black Lives Matter, who hold feminists accountable and say, why aren't you talking more about this? We need more space for this. Like, this is a bigger issue than what you've traditionally focused on.
Sure, but so you, like you said, I mean, I don't know if you say you are a feminist, you identify as a feminist, but the Marxist feminists would come to you and say you're actually not a part of our movement. You shouldn't be properly identified as a feminist, and yet you say that you certainly think that you're a part of the movement, and your internal critiques of the movement are just as valid as anybody else's. But what happens when you run up against people who are in the movement who are trying to basically police you out of the movement? And I feel like I see a lot of that. And maybe this is something that I tend to think is a bad thing about the social media age, is a lot of those kinds of conversations are happening a lot more in public spaces. So, I would identify myself as a conservative, but a lot of people would say I am insufficiently conservative. I'm a rhino. And so, when I criticize Donald Trump or Ted Cruz or Rand Paul or whoever you want to point to, that, my critiques shouldn't be taken seriously because I'm, a rhino. I'm not a true conservative. And a lot of that is happening in public, where a lot of people, are seeing this infighting, and a lot of people would also say that infighting being in public is a bad thing. So how do we navigate these kind of bubbles of the movement or borders of the movement when there are people like that saying, no, you are not, you should not appropriately be considered a part of our movement, and therefore your criticisms in this area are invalid?
I experienced a lot of this when I was writing more about libertarianism. A lot of people wanted to write me out of the movement, and it's funny because at the end of the day, I mean, I guess they're right. I don't believe in the legitimacy of the nation state, and I've been told many, many times that libertarianism is an explicitly political philosophy, and that by political these people mean as relating to the state and not the actual meaning of the word, which is relating to power. Whatever, I think that's dumb. Like, I think libertarianism is dumb because it's an artificial distinction between the state and other forms of coercive power. But fine, whatever. Generally speaking, I think the effort to write people out of movements is as stupid as the effort to critique movements from outside of them. Like, who cares? Like, who cares? Like, if Meghan Murphy wants to continue to call herself a feminist, that's fine. And if anti-capitalists want to be feminists, that's fine. The only thing I'm going to fight about is, what does that word mean? What does feminism mean? Because I reject the idea that you have to be anti-capitalist to be feminist. I think that's very important, and I will fight about that. And how do we best accomplish our goals? And that, I really want people to agree with me on what feminism means, unless we can agree to disagree on how we should go about it. Same thing with libertarianism. If you think that writing, 300-page tomes about Austrian economics is like the way to win liberty, then, go on with your bad self. Like, that's cool. Somebody's got to do it, knock yourself out. I think that it's going to be about appealing to people's emotions and narrative, and showing people that libertarians can have good ideas and still care about people. But whatever, we need all kinds. So, yeah.
Sure. So
I think,
to me, this goes back to maybe a branding problem, or why more people don't call themselves X, Y, or Z. And, for me, I've seen, like you said, talk of what the definition of feminism is or should be. And I wanted to bring this around to, we've seen a lot of kind of feminism, or at least the label itself, breaking into the public consciousness a lot more. And some of our celebrities or public figures being asked if they, identify as a feminist. And I've seen, the kind of a very base level definition a couple years ago, in 5, 6, 8, I'm not sure how many years ago, a lot of, female celebrities would publicly say, oh no, I'm not a feminist because feminists are radicals and they hate men and blah, 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 blah. And then we got a pushback saying, no, feminism is just the belief that, women and men should be equal in the political sphere, in the economic sphere, in the household sphere, just the basic level of the social, political, and economic equality of women and men. And so now a lot of more people are saying, well, of course, yes, I believe in all of those things. So I guess I would identify as a feminist. And then beyond that, though, we're getting kind of, I would say, a more granular criticism. And I have seen this kind of pop up online. There was a column by Jessica Valenti in The Guardian a couple years ago that was basically saying, we can't take this base level definition of feminism as what we're going to define it as, because to be a feminist, you have to actually be advocating for certain policies, certain explicitly political policies, like you have to be pro-choice, you have to be anti-wage gap, and all these other things, which kind of, to me, gives us more of a reversal, trying to shrink the sphere of who can properly be identified as a feminist. And so I wanted to get your perspective on both that expansion and now possibly contraction of a lot of what I would consider to be leading feminists nowadays are trying to, and how they're trying to define the movement.
I see both sides of it. I mean, I'm an anarchist, and I see anarchists promoting Donald Trump or promoting, rejecting Syrian refugees. Like, the anarchist position is, not to promote politicians so much, though I have. The anarchist position is definitely not, is no borders. So, especially for something like those positions, which are not only, in my opinion, not in line with anarchy, but are also kind of embarrassing. Like, I don't want to be associated with, I don't want what I believe to be associated with those actions. The obvious first inclination is to be like, well, they're not a true anarchist, or like, they're not a true feminist. But it's like, if you actually stop to think about it for a second, these purity campaigns don't get you anywhere. Like, people are, if they claim to be a feminist, people are still going to associate you with a Trump supporter who wants to close the borders and not accept Syrian refugees. Like, that's just what it is. The only thing you can do is try to be louder. And so I think that's the way to go about it. Purging people out of your ideology is ineffective. It's a waste of time. It's understandable, but it doesn't really get you anywhere. And it's frustrating to see people, stay there in that knee-jerk response instead of thinking, okay, well, it's a big tent and Donald Trump supporters are here, and that's suboptimal, but, fight speech with speech, right?
Yes, but he's got the biggest megaphone. Would you consider yourself to be a successful victim of a purge? I mean, like you said, when you were writing a little more about libertarianism and you self-identified as a libertarian, you got a lot more pushback, you got a lot more criticism of yourself, until basically you, like you said, you stopped identifying as a libertarian. And I'm someone who says, I'm a big tent for basically everything, because I'm not really in any tent and I want to be in lots of tents. But you said, you identify as an anarcho-capitalist now, and I'm someone who says, well, I traditionally say anarcho-capitalists are under the libertarian tent, though you don't seem to want to be anymore. So I would ask, did that purge tactic work on you? And is that why you have a negative perception of these purging tactics by these mass leaderless movements?
I think it worked on me two ways. I think that I spent a lot of time trying to clean up libertarianism and purge the people who I thought, made us look bad and who I didn't want to be associated with. And then at a certain point you realize that there's a lot more of them than they are of you. And then there's the issue of just, what words mean and what people understand them to mean. And so I found a word that meant much closer to what I believe, which is market anarchy. Now, it's funny because I also assumed that libertarianism was a big enough tent to encompass people who were anarchists but also sympathetic to markets, and was told time and time again that that's not the case, though somehow anarcho-capitalists could be libertarians, but market anarchists couldn't. I don't know, I think it matters a lot less to me than it does to a lot of other people. So I guess, yes, I am a successful victim of an ideological purge, but I also like to be as specific as possible. And I think that I'm a market anarchist. If you want to put that under libertarianism, I think that makes more sense because, again, if you want to be pedantic, if you say libertarianism is a political philosophy, then it has to do with power, not just the power that we call the state. Though then if you want to get into what is the difference between a libertarian and an anarchist, it would be one believes in the legitimacy of the state and the other doesn't. I do not. So, I want to be accurate, and I want to have people waste less time telling me I'm not a libertarian, and I want to beat them to the punch.
I suppose that's a good counter. If someone says you're not a true libertarian, you say, yeah, of course I'm not. And that would end that annoying purge discussion probably. See, on the branding side of things, I'm someone who, and this is just going to be me laying this out, I would say I believe we have patriarchal institutions in society. I believe in the harm of gendered expectations, which I think is a term that I learned from reading some of your work. And I believe there are inequalities between men and women that need to be rectified. However, I don't identify with the feminist label. Well, I would if I hadn't read so many things that said, if I believe X, Y, and Z, then I can't possibly be a feminist. And that, I guess, would end that conversation because, there are certain, it's like, if you don't support the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, you can't be a feminist. If you don't support affirmative consent legislation, you can't be a feminist. And all of these certain things. I actually read someone basically who laid out it's impossible for someone to be a registered Republican and a feminist because, A, for the most part, registered Republicans are pro-life, which is anti-feminist, and B, they're all these other things. And so I wouldn't say that I'm a victim of a purge, but I'm someone who, at least from the conservative side of the spectrum, do find that there are maybe branding or purge issue problems with the label feminism, as there are, as we've discussed with basically all labels. So getting back to our original point, why doesn't feminism appeal to more people? I do think there are people with megaphones who are drawing hard lines and saying, you can't be a feminist if you don't believe these things. And obviously you've experienced it from the Marxist side of the equation, and I'm experiencing it more from on the conservative-ish side of the spectrum side of the equation. So I wonder how we do make some of these labels more appealing. And I'm someone who covered the Tea Party movement when they came up and saw the value of that label kind of plummet precipitously because, and I'd be at Tea Party movements and I'd be interviewing people, and most of them are kind and genteel and genuinely are advocating for positive political change. but then one guy shows up with a Confederate flag, and that's who all the news cameras focus on, and that kind of torpedoes all the good done by a movement. So in this era of mass communication, how do people in a movement try to keep their value of their brand high, and how do you combat some of these negative perceptions that pop up?
I think one thing to remember is that fringe movements attract a certain personality, and that one thing that I just wasn't really prepared for when I started writing about libertarianism under the libertarian label is how antagonistic people were to bringing in more people. Because I thought, okay, well, we're committed to the ideas, and obviously it's easier to get things done when more people are on board with the ideas. So, you want to make these more appealing, right? Not sacrificing any ideological purity, just how do we package them better? And there are a lot of people in libertarianism who do not want that, and they're going to couch it in, oh, we have to be pure, but they want to be offensive for the sake of being offensive because they want to keep the circle small, because this is their little world, and they like it weird, and they feel accepted there, and they feel like if more people come in, then they matter less, and these new people might not like them, and it's just a very, weird, basic, primitive self-preservation for people who are attracted to fringe movements. And so you're going to have that issue, whether it's libertarianism or feminism or Marxism or anything that's not conservative or liberal or something generally, agreed upon. So that's an issue. But I think that as far as, how to deal with that, to deal with those, just accept them and don't try to change their minds, because they're just going to fight you every step of the way because that's what they want to do. Otherwise, in a movement, if you want to promote the ideals of the Tea Party, then you have to be out there representing the Tea Party as someone who's not terrible, and so that's what I'm trying to do as an anarchist and a feminist, is just say, they are trying to write me out, but I'm here, I'm doing my thing. I'm not opposed to, I may be opposed to capitalism, but I'm not opposed to markets. And you can be, we can have our own little party over here and still be feminists. And they can have theirs, and that's fine. We're over here not wearing Confederate flags. We can be Tea Partiers. They can be over there doing their thing. And that's, I think, what people are called to do if you care about a set of ideas, is to represent it the best way you can, and just accept that there are people who are going to fight you every step of the way. And it's funny because it's you're not actually attracted to this movement for the ideas. You're attracted because this is your little social group. But you're going to use purity of ideas to justify being obnoxious and turning people off, which is actually going to hurt the adoption of the ideas. And what you say you want to do is going to not happen because you want to keep this an exclusive club. And that's just a thing. That's just a deal with fringe groups that you're going to have to accept because it's part of the package.
Yeah, when you describe it that way, it reminds me of, you mentioned social group. It reminds me of people who take pride in discovering bands before they get popular.
Yeah.
And saying, no, what you conceive of this band is not the proper conception. And I've been with them since, they were playing underground clubs. And you're trying to kind of distort this experience. But yeah, I think everything that you mentioned there makes a lot of sense. So I think let's leave it for today at that. Thanks a lot for joining me today, Cathy.
Thanks for having me. I had a great time.
And I will see everyone else next time on Blogging Heads.